Hello everybody, this is another process video. This is for Black Oath Games, and this is tracking prey. It's going to be a full process video, 1 hour, 30 minutes. I did edit down some breaks in the process, but other than that, you're getting 100% of what I go through to develop a piece like this. So here you can see I'm just starting on basic copy paper with a number 2 pencil and getting her form in. I knew I sort of wanted her squatting atop this ridge line, and from there I didn't really have much of an idea of what I was going for. I just knew I had to get her body pieces in. So you get a head and a torso. You start throwing some limbs on, and sometimes the limbs work and sometimes they don't. But you can see I kind of pop along, getting in shoulders and arms. And working on the positioning of her face. The face is definitely one of the more important pieces in an illustration, simply because that's what most people look at first and relate to. They're definitely challenging in their own right. Getting in the curve of her breasts now, even though you won't see too much of that because she is going to be wearing some armor and clothing. But always start with the fundamentals of the form, making sure everything flows and there's an underlying figure underneath there. It's not just clothing standing by themselves. So with women, I always try and go a little bit more subtler on the angles. They're a little bit more curved, a little bit more smooth. And so that's what I'm going for here, trying to get in all of the forms right. I'm working on how her hand is going to be positioned. And sometimes that's challenging to get it just right. And so you'll see me kind of popping around, making sure I have the lines that I want. You'll see me working on more of her face here and her jaw. Where her mouth will go and where her nose, the shape of her eyes. So as I was mentioning, this is for Black Oath Games. Alex over there commissioned me to do so far 20 pieces, and it's just been a blast getting to see what I can do with some of these characters that he's had me drawing in the positions that they've had me working in, and it's just been such a fantastic experience working with Black Oath Games. So if you check them out, it's solo game system, but I think it can be played with multiplayer as well. Again, RPG, and Alex is just a phenomenal guy to work with and work for. Gives me free reign and doesn't really give a whole lot of further direction. So it's kind of been nice to be able to just kind of piece these characters together from bits and pieces of my imagination and work in a very unique atmosphere, in that I've got pretty well freedom and fair game as to what I want to depict. And so that's always kind of nice when a publisher will give you enough direction to get started on, but then not be overly picky on what they see. And I suppose that is just my experience, and that I give them a sketch, sometimes two, of what I'm thinking on the particular piece, and then they usually say, yeah, that looks great. So that's been great working with Alex through this process. So check them out. Ker Nethalas is the system that this one is particularly for, and it's for a new part of that called Frostbound Exiles. So check that out. That's not out yet, but I'm sure it's coming soon. I know Alex is still working on it. So anyway, getting her form in. Just again, you know, a lot of people say it's all about the underlying form, and it is. It really is. It's the cylinders and cones and circles and balls that you draw underneath that make the figure, and all the clothing and armor and all that. It's really not anything without the underlying forms. So if you're just starting out, if you're just learning, then the underlying forms is, you know, draw those stick figures and work up to your bubble figures, your ant-shaped figures, and go through all that, because it's truly important. And you know, I'm still learning, as many artists will say, it's a lifelong learning process. It's not just you go to school and you learn how to draw and you do all this, you know, practice, but it really is a lifelong process to be able to do this kind of thing. So I'm not perfect at it. I think I've developed my niche within the industry, but yeah. Anyway, start with your shapes and your forms and your cylinders, and work from there, and then you can work on the other things, but making sure that everything is in perspective correctly. And I think what I've learned this last several months to a year is proportion is a lot of everything, and I'm still working on making sure all the proportions of the figure are exactly as they should be. And so it takes me a little bit to get going here, making sure that, you know, the elbow falls within the midsection of the body, and the hands fall down to just below the hips, and all that is super important when you get to moving your figure in space. And an eraser is your friend. Trust me on this. I use it an awful lot. In fact, I just ordered more erasers because I use them so much. So yeah, from here it's just refining, right, and making sure that where and how I want her position is going to be exactly how it is in the final piece, because that's what's going to make the entire drawing. You know, background and all that. I can draw trees and mountains and all that stuff fairly easy, but it's the figure that always takes the longest. And I bet you if you had asked, or if you've watched other videos, other artists will say the same thing. It's not an easy thing to render or even perfect, and it takes time. So here I'm just trying to block in some of the things at the base of her that you'll see, and this is going to be sort of a snowy rock outcropping that she's going to be standing on, but I did want to show some vegetation coming through, and you can see I'll just rough all this in, try and lend to the overall push of the piece. Unfortunately, I have a tendency to press pretty hard when I'm drawing, and so erasing becomes challenging. It's another thing that I'm sort of trying to work on through this next few months, is just the delicacy that I hold the pencil, and that I'm not pressing as hard. And it's sort of why I went away from, I used to use a Tombow shaker mechanical pencil, which would give me a lot finer line. I wouldn't have to stick it in the auto sharpener as much or at all as I do the number 2, but I feel like I can get a little bit lighter touch with the number 2 And so I've switched to that just within the last few months. Pretty much just since working on Alex's project here. And I like it. I like going back to the wooden number 2 pencil. It seems kind of archaic, but it really does feel, at least, maybe it's psychological and mental for me, but it feels as though I'm not laying in lines as hard as I was, as deep as I was. And unfortunately, when you lay in lines deep, that affects the inking process. And so with the inking process, once you get into that, it'll have a tendency to grab your nib or your pen even into those wells that the pencil has left behind if you're pressing really hard. And as I said, it makes it almost extremely impossible to erase some of those thick lines, so I have to be very careful with that. Alright, so now you can see the figure is in, and I'm starting to work on her clothing a little bit, and just the subtle wrinkles and additions to the form that clothing adds. You'll see me working through this process of what she's going to look like with clothes on. And this honestly just comes from experience and in my head what I want. The setting is fairly, I wouldn't say Stone Age, but it's just a little maybe after Stone Age. There are some rudimentary weapons, but everything is natural. So all natural clothing, leather, hides, furs. So you'll see me working in furs around her arm sleeves and around her cuffs, just to denote that it is a sort of a frost-bound environment. But all that just kind of I work out as the pencil layout process goes. It's not anything that I've sketched multiple times to make sure that I want her cuffs to be fur and her sleeves to be fur, and this is going to be hide, or that's going to be, cured leather or whatever. It's just, kind of as the process unfolds, comes out of the brain. And you can see I wasn't entirely happy with that, and I knew I was going to, rewatching this video, I knew I was going to erase it. But it just goes to show that, the first time you lay something in, and that's why we do it, at least that's why I do it, in pencil first. I know there's others that could probably do a decent ink sketch, but that is not me. I very rarely place inks down without having an underlying pencil on top, and if you can do that, that's some amazing skill, and it takes time to develop, just like any other skill. But yeah, it's not for me. But yeah, so you can see I erased her hand a number of times, and oh man, hands. If eyes are the windows of the soul, then the hands are what define whether you can draw or not. And hands are so difficult. So many different little moving bones and pieces, and the angles that they can achieve to the eye. Very, very difficult. I'm not sure if that is the final position of her hand and arm, because a lot of the times I'll if I'm frustrated with a piece of the illustration, I'll move and I'll go on to something else while I cool down and think about what I'm doing here. So I'm kind of roughing in. She's going to have a high-waisted belt. I think it was pretty common, at least in fantasy illustration, to have women have these high-waisted belts. Slims their figure down a little bit, and works out pretty well for the overall feel and tone of it. And then you throw a little archaic belt on around it, and there you go. There's your attire for a female heroine. A lot of the times what we'll do is, as artists and illustrators, we'll darken in an area just to give it some tone to lay some more defined pencils on top of. And that's what you saw me do there with her lower leg and crotch area. Just kind of laying in some dark tone to denote that that's going to be mostly in shadow, but then I'll go back and you'll see me refine that later. Always making little adjustments with pencil. And faces are another thing that I overwork sometimes, but I just want to make sure that I get them right in pencil before I go to ink, and that helps me kind of lay in the ink correctly. Working on some more detail to define the bosom. Again, you know, these are going to be fairly tight fitting, but it's not, you know, Red Sonja chainmail bikini, so not that I don't like Red Sonja chainmail bikini, but for this particular project it just wasn't fitting the style. You can see me kind of figuring out, and it's at this point where I have to decide what sort of boot she's going to be wearing, and then arranging those lines so that it fits with the overall character and feel. So she's got the pulled down, you know, rough hide sort of boot, and you'll just see me refine that as we get in. Another thing that's super beneficial for artists as they're starting out is to study folds and study how clothing bends on a body. And typically speaking, you can go by a couple of generalizations in that most of your hard lines are going to be closer to where the fold begins, if that makes sense. And so you want to start at like the crook of the elbow or the crook of the knee or the groin, where that pulls the material in and around those curved forms. So sort of what you want to do. And here you can see that her left thigh on our right, the thigh actually curves around towards us, and so those folds are going to be curving around towards us. Especially at the knee, and then her shin actually recedes back into the background, and then her foot comes forward, and so you've got a play of, you know, forms that push in and pull back out. And then of course, in the best comic book fashion, we try and hide our feet because feet are hard. No. But yeah, feet are difficult, but also part of that is fading, you know, feet into the background a little bit so that they're not taking all of the viewer's attention away. And so I know it's a joke in the illustrator and artist community that we hide feet, but it's not because they're hard, it's because they're not important, typically speaking. You know, unless they're coming at you in a kick or something like that, they're just not that important. They have to be there to complete the figure, but by and large, they could fade back into the background, and that's really the reason. Not that we can't draw feet, although they are difficult, not too dissimilar from hands. Again, with the push and pull effect, you know, we've got the upper part of her torso kind of pushing out, and her abdomen pushing out, and then as she bends at the waist, it's going to push in and then push back out again as it bends into the groin and that kind of thing. So, all right, there's a completed look at the sketch, and you can see I've added a lot of background, but very rudimentary. And we'll get into inking now. I do use a Hunt 102 Crow Quill dip nib for inking. And I think I've stated this before if you watch some of my other videos, I kind of always start away from the main figure just to sort of get warmed up to the inking process. Again, inking is a lot different than penciling. You know, obviously with pencils, you know, to a certain extent, yeah, I can get rid of that line, I can change that line, but with inking, it's permanent, and that really, you know, over time it doesn't weigh so much on your mind, I suppose, but you always have that in the back of your mind as an inker. Once you start inking, you know that that line is there. And there are subtle ways that you can kind of hide mistakes or hide things or change it, but for the most part, you know, certainly don't want to, you know, get out the whiteout or the acrylic white ink or the gouache and cover up a lot of the drawing. So you really want to make sure that your lines from your penciling are, you know, close to 100% before you start getting your inks in there. I intentionally left background music. Normally I have music or something playing in the background here, even post-production for the videography, but I wanted you guys to hear sort of what I hear as I'm inking, and that's the nib scratch on this. And this is pretty smooth Strathmore Bristol, but it still scratches. Now there's a vellum surface that the scratch is, I don't even use it because the scratch drives me nuts after a while, but usually I'll have some music even in my studio just playing, or during post-production, like I said, I'll put some on here. But just hearing that scratch across the paper, I think, is something that you guys probably didn't realize happens. Alright, so you can see rocks are sort of time consuming here, just trying to get the shadows, and depending on which way I draw the line depends on whether that piece of rock is receding into shadow, coming out at us, or just, you know, kind of staying there where the light can hit it. So, you know, your white areas are where the light is going to hit the hardest, and then as you get into the recesses of the rock, it'll be darker, obviously. And the direction of the line, believe it or not, makes a big difference when it comes to what that looks like and exactly how that rock is perceived as to whether it's coming out at us or receding into the background or being struck by light. Kind of get lost in the moment when you're doing rocks like that. It's very relaxing. Here you can see I'm working on, as I was thinking about how she would have gotten up on this precipice to look out over what she's tracking, I was thinking like the snow there would definitely be harder. You've got icicles, and sometimes in the snow, if you guys have ever experienced this, I live in Michigan, so I experience this quite a bit. When it gets really cold, the snow actually creates these sheets. When you step into them, they break into these sheets. And so I wanted to hint at those thin, jagged sheets a little bit as she stepped on them, and different parts of them were rising up on this crusted snow, kind of like stepping through a chunk of plate glass. They fracture and they kind of stick up all over the place, but they are definitely unique to a super cold snow. And so, when you have experiences like that as an illustrator, you want to. I try to put those into my artwork as much as possible, and I think that was just a way to kind of reference that, how cold it is, and whether that'll translate to people who have never experienced that or not. Probably not, but those who have and who have seen that in their life will go, wow, that's what that is, and they'll understand it. And now you'll understand it just watching this video. Artwork really is about experiencing and trying to convey a sense of feeling that you have, or an experience that you had. Through a medium that is essentially two-dimensional, meant to evoke some sort of feeling about this particular character that you're illustrating or scene that you're illustrating. And I don't know, it's one of those unique things we get to experience as humans, is that we can relive or recreate these experiences that we've had through media like this. You could see me going from quick lines to kind of focused lines, and that's just to sort of break up the shape of the line. And rock, when it is fractured, isn't always precise, and so that's an attempt to sort of mimic that imprecision, if you will, of rock. And as I do quick lines and choppy lines, that's sort of my way to sort of show the irregularity of rock, along with the shadow and all the rest of it.